All right.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Peter Knorringa, Professor of Private Sector and Development at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. He will talk about frugal innovation in Africa, an academic and policy agenda. The webinar will explain frugal innovation, a simple, affordable, robust innovation developed for under conditions of scarcity, in many cases also with more careful resource use or making use of renewables. While conventional innovations are often over-engineered and thus initially too sophisticated and expensive for middle-class and poorer consumers, frugal innovation are developed specifically for less affluent users. The next step is to discuss three main types of frugal innovators, firms, NGOs, citizens, provide some examples, and then go through how some such frugal innovations has become a focus in academic studies, trying to make sense of the importance of the innovation outside of the R&D departments of large companies in the ongoing digital revolution. The final part of the presentation puts forward some ideas on how frugal innovation thinking can dynamize policy agendas on, for example, agro, industrialization, and local economic development in Africa. Peter Knorringa is Professor of Private Sector and Development at the ISS, as I've mentioned, of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. His research focuses on how entrepreneurs and firms impact upon attempts to achieve more socially responsible and environmentally sustainable forms of development. He has worked on small and medium-sized firms, entrepreneurship, local economic development, industrial clusters, role of trust and networking, global value chains, private governance, and sustainable standards, and more recently on frugal innovation. He's one of the co-founders and president director of the Leiden Delft Erasmus Center on Frugal Innovation in Africa, based in the Netherlands. Without much ado, Peter, floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Ali, for this wonderful invitation. Let me see if the share screen works again in the way it did while we were practicing. Yeah, it works, I think. You can see it. The only thing I don't see yet is how to, yeah, okay. In the series of the webinar, there was a very important sentence for me. It's that you aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may, or perhaps should, become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. And I think frugal innovation could be one of these concepts, or at least in this presentation, I'm going to try and convince you of the fact that frugal innovation might be one of these new concepts that we can usefully bring in the aftermath of COVID-19. The presentation will talk a little bit about definition, who are these frugal innovators. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the academic agenda and the policy agenda. First, something from just a few weeks ago. A team of people led by Yusuf Bilasanmi, who is a PhD student from Nigeria, who's doing his PhD in the UK. And they developed a new low-cost ventilator, which doesn't need electricity, but could help hospitals to treat COVID-19 patients. And in the news blog from the university, they say, this innovation is simple to use, it's low cost, non-electric, and oxygen efficient. Now, especially these first two elements are part of our working definition of what we call frugal. Literally, frugal means sparing or thrifty. It is also often labeled as being careful use of resources and increased use of renewables, and a strong focus on making things simple and smart. Now, this does not mean old or outdated technology. It often makes use of fourth industrial revolution technologies, like, for example, something that is widespread in Africa, M-Pesa, which is quite technologically advanced in the back office, but it is very simple, easy to use by consumers, and it is an affordable and simple way to be able to transfer money without having a bank account. Frugal innovation for us focuses on the combination of low cost and high functionality, and the reduction of over-engineering, which is maybe the most important focus point when you think of the pandemic. And it focuses specifically on low-income households. So while traditionally or conventionally, innovations tend to be relatively high cost and sophisticated, frugal innovations, by contrast, actually focus specifically on lower income households and try to make these products, services, and systems simpler, more robust, and easy to use. Now, this discussion around frugal innovation is becoming increasingly on the radar, both in the policy debate, like the recent study done by the European Union that you see here on the left, on frugal innovation and re-engineering of traditional techniques, and also in the academic debate in a recent set of papers in an issue of Nature with a focus on sustainability. Now, I will first say a few things about the academic debate. First of all, this is not a new thing. Yeah? Already Adam Smith, the godfather perhaps of economics, who was a philosopher by training, already talked quite a lot about frugality and frugal. In his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, his most famous book, he uses frugal or frugality 37 times. And the quote here is from The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his other famous book. Frugality is important in the process of producing economic wealth, and at the same time, to avoid a destructive cycle of commerce, leisure, luxury, and corruption. And this is in the 1700s. Yeah? Now, the attention for frugal innovation got a new boost around 10, 12 years back when The Economist started talking about it. And there was a book by Navi Raju and Jadip Prabhu on frugal innovation, how to do more with less. When you look at how the academic debate is evolving at the moment, we see three sort of recent streams in the literature. One that focuses on technology and engineering, looking at the innovation process and the stages in the innovation process, with a focus on issues like value-sensitive designing, robustness of innovations, simplicity, and affordability. A second stream focuses on entrepreneurship and management studies, with a focus on issues like the base or the bottom of the pyramid, and looking at how frugal innovations can be a very successful commercial proposition for companies that are targeting um, middle income, lower middle income, and poor consumers. Um, it also talks about social entrepreneurship as a way to achieve societal goals, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. The third stream is about development studies and sociology. This is about how poorer people innovate and deal with scarcity. This is where terminology is used around grassroots innovation, jugaad innovation, a Hindi word for frugal, and bricolage, the French word for trying to make ends meet with the limited means that you have available. In this literature, there is now also increasing focus on what are the economic, social, and environmental impacts of frugal innovation. We often see three quite different types of frugal innovators. Um, and I want to briefly mention them, and then I have three slides with examples of these three types of innovators to indicate the kind of diversity. First of all, firms that develop frugal innovation to make profits and penetrate new markets. Secondly, NGOs, often with donor funding, that develop frugal innovations to address societal challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, individuals and communities who develop their own frugal innovations to address their own bottlenecks. Even though I'm now splitting them up in three, maybe the most important point to mention of the different types of people involved in frugal innovations is that these are usually not developed by one person or one set of persons in isolation. Almost all the more successful frugal innovations are examples of co-creation and using many different actors from different locations with different kinds of knowledges. And of course, in these interaction processes, we need to be aware of power differences between the different actors involved in developing frugal innovation. Now, an example from the firm sector, from health, is the portable electrocardiogram from General Electric, a portable machine developed specifically for rural areas in India, making it much more easy, cheap, and simple to measure the basic heart functionalities. And for 80 or 90% of people that feel that there is something wrong with their heart, this basic machine is enough to decide whether or not they should actually go to a major city with a big hospital or not. Interestingly, this machine is now being sold to general practitioners in, for example, the United States and in Europe, who have this machine in order to be more critical about whether or not they should send patients actually to the hospital for further checks. The second category, NGOs, social enterprises. This is just a picture from a recent prize that was given by the European Union on affordable high tech for humanitarian aid, where the frugal innovation that got one of the prizes was one of these 3D printing designs to help with actually printing in refugee camps components as part of water taps. And these are a few examples of what we often call individual or more community frugal innovations that are based on the ingenuity of people trying to solve their own problems, coming up with really interesting and important innovations. The additional debates that are now coming up in frugal innovation are about scaling and governance. For example, in the provision of basic services like water, energy, health, while also looking at the political economy and societal impacts of frugal innovation. And we see, but that's really just starting. And it would be great if maybe some of you who are listening to this would later say, oh, well, I'm interested in something else, like, for example, sustainability, climate change, green transformation, circular economy, and the list it goes on here, industrialization, food security, intellectual property rights, take your pick. For many of these topics, a frugal angle can make a nice new dynamic to your studies. And this is what we're trying to promote also. Now, moving to the policy agenda, there was a recent report, it's I think 2018 or 2017, by UNCTAD on new innovation approaches to support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. With a kind of confusing terminology, because that is the world that we are in at the moment, in the sense that while conventional innovation is increasingly seen as quite limited, the sort of adjectives that we put in front of it to sort of broaden up the debate are not yet sort of crystallized out. So whether one uses frugal or social or inclusive or grassroots or jugaad innovation, these are all attempts at trying to grasp at a broader meaning of the innovation policy agenda. Yeah, so first of all, this is about innovation beyond only commercializing scientific discoveries. And it is beyond public sector R&D investments and incentives to large firms, but a more frugal approach to simultaneously address rising inequalities and environmental destruction. And this is at the moment being discussed in sort of policy agendas at quite different levels of analysis. Yeah, first of all, the mission-driven innovation strategies, which is an instrument now very much sort of promoted also by the European Union, but you also see it, for example, in the 2030 vision strategy of Kenya. There's a lot of discussion about it in South Africa and in many other places, where it's not so much the innovation as such that is the key thing, but it is all about what are the major mission issues that you need to address. Yeah, and that could be a sustainable city, or making sure that all the plastics are out of our environment, or other kinds of major missions. And within that, it is increasingly recognized that we, of course, we also need high-tech, fundamental, new scientific breakthroughs to find solutions to these bigger missions. But we also need more inclusive, more sustainable, more localized involvement of people with great ideas at the local level, who have the experience and the knowledges about their own context. And putting these together is one of the ways to broaden the innovation policy agenda. Same is true in industrialization policy. And I have another example on the next slide for sort of more local development perspective. In local innovation practices and resilience, the idea is about how do you combine effectively local knowledges with new technologies and research and development expertise through adaptive learning and innovative business models. Now, for that, one needs to rethink more societally desirable innovation trajectories, with again a focus on reducing this over-engineering. Yeah? Over-engineering is one of the main ailments in our modern society. And simultaneously, to involve lower income innovators and citizens in what kind of innovations do we need to address our major challenges. And doing that in a way that focuses on adaptation, simplicity, and functionality. And coming back to the COVID-19 discussions, where we have seen that in many countries, in the medical sector and in getting approval from ministries and from medical agencies, etc., there was a break on many of these innovations because they did not yet follow all the optimal standards that have been set for equipment and for other kinds of issues in previous years. And that it is now time to focus much more on a good enough instead of optimal practices. to enhance resilience and increasing the speed of local innovation processes. To conclude, a focus on frugal innovation does not mean we want to do away with investments in R&D or with investing in high-tech innovations. But we need to connect the two processes. So these frugal innovations, social innovations, inclusive innovations need to be woven into the innovation agenda as a way to make policies more inclusive and sustainable. At our Center for Frugal Innovation in Africa, we engage in an empirical research agenda to see under what conditions frugal innovations are more likely to contribute to addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And I really look forward to those of you who want to get in touch with us in the coming days or weeks. And I have our website here on the next and final slide to sort of get in touch with us about the kind of research that you are doing or the kinds of policy that you are involved in, and whether you can see how maybe a frugal approach or a frugal solution might contribute to dynamize the thinking around these issues. And in that way, to make frugal innovation part of that new agenda in the aftermath of COVID-19. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Ali.
Thank you, Peter, for a very precise and to the point and yet very wide scope presentation. Please, if you have any questions or comments, please write it in the chat box. I'll start with the discussion with, I remember almost more than probably 10 years ago, there was a very interesting case of IDO, the design thinking company, and they had a new project of a venture to develop the visor. The visor was one of the early PDAs, and it was supposed to sort of replace a competitor's popular Palm 5, which was much more expensive. The interesting thing that I've noticed is that most of the students that they took, it's an MBA course, most of the students that they took this course thought IDO should not worry about low-cost products. There is this entrenched mentality that innovation means leading-edge technology and expensive technology, and otherwise don't bother. Now, my question to you is, how do you overcome this mindset and become more practical, more pragmatic about developing things, which is much needed, as you said?
Yeah, well, maybe, shall I stop the sharing and maybe we can see also a few other people?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe that is right at the start, the $100 million question, Ali. When I teach about this, I often start with asking people to put their mobile phones on the table. And there you see the same thing. Most people use less than 20% of the possibilities and opportunities that are actually on their iPhones or Nokias or whatever they are. But they're still willing to pay also for the other 80% that they're not using. And changing that mindset is perhaps one of the most difficult things that we have to engage in. What I'm not advocating is that we should all lead much more simple lives, because that I think is a dead end, because that I don't think is going to happen. But I think the combination of convincing people about the need for a more sustainable production and consumption system, to have a livable planet also for next generation, and to make the connections more visible between these different logics, I think that will make it possible to argue in favor of these more frugal solutions. There is, however, a very unfair dimension to that, which I'm very much aware of. What you're basically saying also with this approach, if you're going for more frugal consumption and production patterns, is that those who have lived in poverty until now and who are sort of starting to become middle class will not be allowed or not be able to enjoy the middle class style of the Europeans and Americans from the 1960s to the 2000s. Because if we would all consume as the average American, the planet would have exploded by now. So this is not an easy sell, obviously. And at the same time, I think it's very necessary that we need to understand that we have been, in a way, we got used to having so many trinkets and bells and additional features in our day-to-day machineries, but also in the hospitals and also in our cars, things that we seldom use and that most of us really don't need. So there's a lot of scope for making things more frugal without actually taking away any of the consumption enjoyment in consumer behavior. But it's not an easy sell, I realize that.
Right, right. I'm gonna take questions from the audience and then I come back to my questions and comments. I'm gonna start with Ronald Bardi. Please unmute yourself, Roland.
Yeah, good afternoon or good evening. I did a work in Ghana and I came across, in the north of Ghana, I came across two very important issues I want to ask about if you also think that this is a valid issue. One is indigenous wisdom. We have such a big treasure in these countries, and they did their inventions with this wisdom. And to some extent, they are neglected in the Western world. To some extent, I think we should make much more use of what has been known for centuries with agriculture and health in these. And this is also a type of, I would say, revitalizing innovation. Yeah. The other question is, on my work in Ghana, I came onto the United Nations Education Centers for Sustainable Development. They have a big program with this about 100 regional centers for expertise. I'm sure I didn't cooperate with them because my assignment was relatively short, but I think that's one thing I would like to know of you. Are you connected and how do they work? Because there is always much advertising, you never know what is. And the last word, when we were asked to give a question beforehand in the seminar, I came across a wonderful term in the Nigerian language, which is kanju, which means resilience, but it means to build back better. So innovate while rebuilding. And that is also, I think, an issue which you have come across. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kanju, indeed, sort of building back better resilience would be another example of the sort of basket of labels that at the moment we are sort of considering, like frugal or like inclusive or social or jugaad, in terms of thinking, again, more deeply about the role of innovation and what kind of innovation do we actually need for future development of our planet. So yes, very much so. I don't know much about the UN Education Center for Sustainable Development, I'm afraid, but I very much like your first point, so I would like to say maybe a little bit more about that. The indigenous wisdom in areas like agriculture and health, and the importance of revitalizing that know-how, I think that is a critical issue. There is a PhD student at our center who's actually researching on these kinds of knowledges. And I think I actually saw his name also somewhere on this list. So maybe he can comment on this himself later on, Virendra Singh. What is important to mention here, indeed, is that while on the one hand, these indigenous knowledges are of critical importance, at the same time, they cannot on their own be used to address also, for example, the newer problems around climate change and environmental degradation. So we need to find ways in which these indigenous knowledges and wisdoms, together with new kinds of insights that come maybe from new technologies, for example, combining satellite images with local knowledges, that is the kind of combinations that we need to address our major challenges.
Thank you. The second question is coming from El Hassan El Sabri. Please unmute yourself, Hassan.
Oh. Hello. So my name is El Hassan Sabri. I work in the areas of innovation management and university-industry collaboration, especially in developing countries. You made a point about the relationship of frugal innovation to intellectual property, and I would like to hear more from you. Expanding on this issue, because on the one hand, there is this drive to sort of document all of these frugal innovations, make especially those by communities, and even I think at the American University in Cairo, they have this one of the research projects is ongoing, trying to the scientification of sort of popular or public innovations. On the other hand, there is always the emphasis on, we need to deal with this as different from how we deal with, for example, commercialization of academic knowledge or those kinds of, standard innovation paradigms or frameworks. So I would like to hear your take on how we should approach these issues, given those two sort of opposing approaches. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's also indeed a very important point that I just sort of mentioned in half a sentence. Our experience so far is that with, let's say, lawyers or people in legal departments in universities who specialize in intellectual property rights, they are not very eager and often also not very able to understand the logic of these localized, more informal frugal innovations. So, like you said, there is indeed a kind of a mismatch between the kind of people that look at these local community innovations and try to sort of document them and perhaps preserve them, and to some extent try to arrange also property rights for these innovations, as for example, the National Innovation Foundation in India is making an attempt in that direction. But there is quite a gap indeed. However, there are initiatives, for example, from WIPRO, the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization. They now have a separate group of people working on what they call informal sector innovation, which again is a somewhat different label for trying to do the same thing, which is to broaden the innovation debate and to also look at what is happening under the radar of the patents dynamics. And I think that is where very important new research needs to be done. And it would be great. I met last year, just before the lockdowns started, and I met a lady from Nigeria, who was a lawyer by background, who was interested in this, but we haven't really sort of made any progress. But this is typically something where sort of people with a legal background, but who are not in the sort of mainstream formal sector patent-dominated logic, but who are willing to step out of that and work together maybe with people that are focused on grassroots and frugal innovations to think about how to set up an intellectual property rights system that can work for these informal innovations. I would leave it there, Ali.
Okay. Fayez Sheikh, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Professor Ali, and thank you, Professor Knorringa.
Hello, Fayez.
Greetings from Kashmir.
Yeah.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely speak from Professor Knorringa's COVID-19 comment. I think COVID-19 has offered a brilliant window of opportunity to realize the significance of these bottom-up innovations. We have seen how these bottom-up frugal innovations have offered a glimmer of hope. When formal systems failed, then these alternative non-formal innovations started filling the gaps. And we have seen some recent articles which appeared in Nature, Harvard Business Review, and some other leading news magazines which talked about these frugal and bottom-up innovations. But while comparing frugal innovations from India and with frugal innovation and technology which is coming from China, I could see the role of government becomes very important. Although, this whole frugal innovation discourse and grassroots innovation discourse particularly, it started from India, and you talked about National Innovation Foundation. That's the only organization in India which has documented more than 300,000 bottom-up, these grassroots innovations. And India is the only country where these local innovators, bottom-up innovators, are honored by the President House, by the President of India. But if you look at the China case with the Indian case, the successful models are coming from China, precisely because the role of government is very explicit. And the role of universities is playing a very dominating role. So that actor-sector collaboration in terms of scaling up these bottom-up innovations, that's more vibrant in China, while as in India, we don't have that vibrant or robust actor-sector involvement. And the second important thing which I observed from India and China was connecting frugal innovations and bottom-up innovations with digital technologies. So I was trying to know from Professor Knorringa, what kind of insights, or how would you see frugal innovation in a post-COVID world where government have to intervene with latest innovation frontiers, for example, digital technologies, artificial intelligence? Is there any such scope where government can play a very dominant role in terms of scaling up these bottom-up innovations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fayez. That's indeed an important question. As you know, I know more about India and Africa than I know about China, so it's a bit difficult for me to respond to the China-specific point. But I think your general point, indeed, is that we should look more carefully also at the role of government to make these kinds of frugal innovations also scalable and meaningful for more people. And in that sense, I would say yes, there is now also starting in Europe, typically enough. I was in a number of seminars with people in Brussels over the last 6 months or so, that increasingly in Brussels, they are starting to see that their innovation strategies are also too exclusive and too much for sort of one high-end group. And they're struggling to find new ways to broaden the horizon. However, in many of the poorest countries, giving the government an important role in bottom-up or frugal innovations is also quite risky in terms of capturing the benefits and the whole logic of these innovation processes that need also that kind of flexibility. So it's possible where the role of the government can be indeed conducive to this kind of innovation processes and helps to be more inclusive and sustainable. And of course, this is not the moment or the place to discuss whether the Chinese government is fulfilling that sort of characterization altogether. But it is clear that in China, it is very commonplace that in whatever new development takes place, the government takes a lead role, and it has pros and cons. I don't yet see how that would translate in a similar way in, for example, India or in Africa. Especially, well, it depends a little bit on which countries in Africa you're talking about, of course. The other point you made, connecting frugal innovations with digital solutions. I think, yes, that's definitely part of the future logic. The digital revolution is really a revolution in which we are only sort of, we are in the midst, that we don't know exactly where we are. We know that it is changing a lot, maybe not everything, but a lot. We don't know yet very much about how it is actually going to impact systematically. But digital technologies are, of course, becoming a general purpose technology, like electricity in a previous industrial revolution. So yes, it is almost unthinkable that there will be really successful, scalable frugal innovations in the next 20 years that do not have also a strong digital connection. And for me, that is also one of the reasons why the present frugal innovation debate is different from, for example, the appropriate technology debates in the 1970s and 1980s. That this is not about romantic ideas about the past, but it is about trying to find more inclusive and sustainable futures. And that includes both communities as well as NGOs, as well as small and medium scale enterprises and multinational corporations and governments. So all actors have a role in that game towards the future. I will leave it at that, Ali.
Okay. Thomas, please unmute yourself, sir.
Hello. I'm audible, right?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for a very elaborative presentation. I am, in fact, a student of Peter at ISS. I come from India, and some of my, I have a couple of questions regarding one issue is, when you have detailed about different conceptual and theoretical understanding about the different kinds of innovation and frugal innovation. So some of the things I have been into various healthcare, public health innovation for almost 15 years. So some of the challenges for the innovators are, one is the visibility, how the innovation could take into the commercial space through larger visibility. And secondly, in terms of scaling up, how could we take it forward? Scaling up require funding and also technical expansion. So there are a lot of other things involved. So and in the third important thing is like the government level involvement in terms of regulation, but the other kind of accreditation and all these things. So my question will be how the Frugal Innovation Center or the kind of things that you are proposing will help the innovators in terms of these three areas. Like, for example, one is visibility, and then in terms of or the potential funders, and also the third in terms of connecting with the government in terms of the regulatory this thing. So how do you think the innovation center that you are proposing will help the innovators in these directions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for that question. That's not an easy question. Let me start by saying something which you shouldn't take as defensive, but we are an academic center, so we are not actually consulting with the frugal innovators themselves. We are trying to understand where and when these frugal innovations are more likely to make positive impacts. Now, how do we do that? By looking, among others, at successful examples, but also at failure cases, and to try and learn what the differences are and how we could advise, for example, governments, NGOs, and companies and communities to develop frugal innovations that have more chances of scaling successfully. Now, in terms of visibility, scaling, and government regulations, or the role of dealing with the state, you know as well as I do that many of these sort of smaller, locally successful initiatives, once you try to scale them and make them more visible and big and important, other things start coming into the picture. It becomes also a matter of some political power, maybe some local elites would become suddenly interested in what you are doing. And because of the need for example, economies of scale, technical expansion, the original innovation may lose part of its soul in terms of how it was set up and how it was sort of imagined in the first place. And then you also often see that people from the outside that were not involved in initial stages are trying to take over. So making people aware of these relative risks involved in scaling these kinds of frugal innovations is an important part of our responsibility to not be naively promoting these kinds of innovations, as we know that there are, especially in the processes towards scaling and increasing visibility, there are also serious risks involved for the people that were involved in developing the initial innovation.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Singh, you raised your hand before. Are you still?
Yeah, Birendra Singh is the person doing the research that I talked about. So if he is willing to speak, that would be nice.
Okay, I think he logged out. So anyway, will Carla, please unmute yourself.
Hello. Thank you for the webinar. I think it's very interesting. I'm doing my master's thesis on the topic of reverse innovation. So developed countries have realized now as well that frugal innovations are also relevant to developed countries. As Professor Knorringa mentioned, the first example from General Electric in the health sector. And there are many health innovations from India, for example. And my question is, why do you think some innovations, some frugal innovations, are able to scale from countries such as Africa and India to developed countries? Because this has happened. And why others fail? And the ones that succeed, my question would be, do you think that these developing countries such as Africa or India, where these frugal innovations have their origins, if they can somehow benefit when these innovations diffuse to developed countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a nice question. This what indeed in Europe is called reverse innovation is becoming increasingly a hot topic. Like I mentioned also that the EU in Brussels, they are now looking at these kinds of innovations. There was a recent UN report on the 50 most important innovations in health relevant to COVID from Africa. First of all, there is sometimes a kind of hesitation in, for example, in Europe, thinking that how could good innovations come from, let's say, Egypt or Tanzania or Kenya or South Africa. And of course, they're wrong about that. That, of course, is very much possible. Now, why do some fail and some succeed? I think the ones that succeed in becoming also important in Europe are the ones that have a combination of reducing this over-engineering, while at the same time being able to claim relative high quality. Because that is often the reason why reverse innovations fail in richer markets. if the average consumer, and that comes back to Ali Awini's question at the beginning, if consumers in relatively richer environments get the feeling that they are being given a sort of second-rate substitute for the real product. And if once that happens, then people become relatively uneasy and restless, and the frugal innovation is likely not to become successful. But if they can combine reducing the over-engineering, having a reasonable low-cost price, good functionality, then some of these examples are really successful. There is one other limitation, and that has to do with the slowness of change in rich economies. Yeah? For example, the way in which mobile banking or mobile money transfer has boomed in Kenya, in Tanzania, Uganda, etc., etc., and also, for example, in China, in the countryside. While in the US and in big parts of Europe, this is going much and much slower. Now, of course, because of the pandemic and shops closing and online shopping becoming more important, it has now gotten a relative boost, but still, this is a major issue is with reverse innovation, is that the speed of innovation adoption in Europe and the US and in Australia and Japan is much slower, especially if innovations come from the outside. And in that sense, I think many countries in Africa, but also in India, and of course in China, the adoption of innovation rate or speed is much, much higher. And it's an open question for how long the European Union, for example, can still claim that they are the innovation hub of the world. I think in the next 10 to 15 years, there will be passed by innovations coming from other parts of the world. And that's not a radical thought. I think that is simply an observation on the basis of how things are developing. I'm not sure I've completely answered your question, Carla, but I hope you will write a good thesis on this.
Let us try Behindra again. Mr. Singh, would you please unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Avni, and thank you, Professor Knorringa. Actually, I'm on travel, so I cannot open my video. Actually, I'm in car.
Don't worry. Just,
I'm driving.
Just ask you. I'll comment about what.
So, yeah. So actually, I don't have any question, but I have a little bit a small response about the question raised by Ronald on combining new technologies with the local wisdom, because my research is related to that particular point. So my experience till so far is a better understanding of local knowledge systems or local wisdoms is important, especially when we deploy or when we try to give people certain solutions designed by the outsiders. So to minimize the hierarchy or the politics already embedded in local systems, to minimize that conflict where new and old, both kind of knowledge can come together in a more synergetic way rather than in a conflicting way. So the better understanding of local traditional knowledge is important, one thing. And second thing, frugal innovations are often a combination of the knowledge systems or knowledges coming from different sources. So I think that is also important. So that was the response I wanted to bring in to the discussion. And thank you so much for nice conversation and exciting talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Birendra, for making this good addition. Yeah, and travel safely.
Yes. Please don't use
thank you.
wide while driving. Okay. Had other comments, please? Hassan, would you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the chance again to ask the core topic I'm quite passionate about. I studied under Dr. Sunil Mani when I was in Japan, and he's kind of very into this topic. Being an academic, I would like to ask you if because working on the university industry collaboration in developing countries, I always I realized there is a sort of it's very difficult to apply the kind of literature you find on university industry collaboration in developed countries on situations in developed countries. Because equipment and facilities in the universities are different, needs of industries and companies are different. So I was wondering, you've already put firms or companies as one source of frugal innovations in developing countries. I was wondering if you see universities in the same lens as well. Of course, there's so much advanced research going on in many developed countries, in many developing countries. But at the same time, many of the research projects, especially graduation projects with students, those kinds of things, especially in certain fields, these are not what you would classify as pure academic innovation in the sense that you would do this in a Western university. I was wondering how you see the universities in developing countries in this lens. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important question also. I see an increasing commitment by universities across the world in trying to develop, for example, projects for master students or even for bachelor students and also for PhDs that sort of combine issues of innovation, developing new technologies, new designs with societal impact aims. So with a conscious combination with ideas around promoting inclusion and sustainability. We are at the moment finalizing a handbook on frugal innovation, and there's one chapter from universities in Brazil that are involved in this, and one chapter from universities in South Africa that are involved in these kinds of activities, and that are consciously trying to sort of, together with the local communities that they work with, to also train their students in seeing both sides of the coin, in a sense, that you want to develop new things, but at the same time, you want to make sure that they are not too distanced from what is happening in the locality, often relatively near to the university. So it's also about, like what Birendra was saying, that in many cases, these two exist as separate silos, and bringing them together already in your educational path, I think, is critical. And in that sense, universities have a very important role to make sure that the next generations of researchers, as well as policymakers and practitioners, are much more able from early on in their career to combine these pathways of looking for innovations that stimulate new economic growth, as well as those policies that stimulate inclusion and sustainability, and not to treat them as two separate things where you first try to create growth and then you try to repair, for example, inequalities or clean up environmental destruction. And I do believe that universities have a very important role in that. At the same time, we all know that in many of the poorer countries, it's very difficult for universities to actually play this role because of underfunding and other issues in these universities. But in principle, universities have a key role in promoting these kinds of dynamics and logics for more frugal solutions to our societal challenges.
Thank you, Hassan. Well, we're almost getting to the end of the time. I'm going to exercise my power as the moderator. And I just have two comments. The first comment is that when we talk about frugal innovation, we should not ignore process innovation. It's not just about product innovation. There are many examples, especially in medical operations, of brilliant frugal innovation the cost down. This is the first comment. The second comment is there is an interesting parallels between the lean concept, which was basically started end of World War II, Japan, very minimal resources, huge ambitions, and frugality, which was developed at most of the people in India. One of the interesting things also, the concept of lean, the lean startup, the concept of a minimum viable product, which is exactly what you've mentioned. Forget the bells and whistles; they don't add value. Just give me something that works, that delivers. I just want to get your feedback about this before we wrap up.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can be brief about that. First, you're very right in saying we should not ignore process innovations. The only problem for me, in a sort of trying to be brief and quick in a presentation, is that the product examples are easiest. People can immediately see that product. But you're very right. The process innovations, but also the business model innovations, are often at least as important for frugal innovations as compared to the actual designing of the product itself. Often it is in clever new business models, like, for example, with solar energy, that people don't actually need to buy the solar panels, but they just pay as they go while using them or leasing them. So the innovation is often in the process, it's in the business model, it's in the systems. But that's my only excuse, the product examples in a presentation like this. On your other point, yes, I think lean and frugal have much in common. It is in a way, one of the major differences was, I think, if I remember correctly from what I did as a student on lean production in Japan, etc., is that it was less concerned with issues of inclusion and sustainability. It was more about increasing the efficiency in the production process and in indeed having a no-frill solution to things, like sort of re-engineering the American cars in Japan and coming up with a car that could do the same thing with half the number of components in it. But yes, in terms of reducing over-engineering, there are strong overlaps. And I think we can bring a number of these ideas together in thinking about future models that are relevant for both business school teaching, but also development studies teaching. So I think we have a common challenge there that it would be good to work on for the coming year.
Lovely. Peter, I really thank you for a very interesting webinar, very thought-provoking. It's just been a great discussion. I really thank you.
My pleasure.
I thank you all for participating in this webinar. I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday, March 24th. We will have the presentation called The Business of Changing the World. The speaker is Raj Kumar. Raj Kumar is the president and editor-in-chief of DevEx. I look forward to seeing you all. Again, thank you, Peter. Thank you all for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peter.